Binance's Crypto Roundup for Friday, July 12th, 2024. Ron Quaranta here with my dear friend and amazing co-host, the one, the only David Brill. David, I think Josh is somewhere heading to the Gulf Stream at Brussels Airport. Hopefully she'll join us a bit later on. We've got lots to cover. We're back from a bit of a hiatus over the Independence Day holiday week. For everyone in the audience, thank you for joining us. If you've got comments or questions for David or I, please put them in the chat. We'll be on LinkedIn Live and Twitter. Sorry, X, I do it every time. And our usual disclaimers, David, obviously everything we're discussing shouldn't be considered accounting, investment, legal, or tax advice. We'll be talking tokens, and obviously David and I are not recommending any particular tokens, and everything we're talking about is our own opinion and doesn't necessarily represent the opinions of our firms. David, welcome back, buddy.
Thanks. I'm coming to you from NYC this week, and it's been an interesting week here. And boy, the last 2 weeks have just been fast and furious. So I'm looking forward to diving into this with you.
There's a lot to cover, David, and I'm going to rip up the script right out of the gate because you sent a text message the other day. Obviously, a lot of economic data has come out. We'll cover Chevron, we'll cover ETH ETFs, and we'll talk about all of that stuff. But the Chevron difference, the economic data that came out, you and I were looking at charts from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Yesterday, CPI came out that said it looks like inflation's cooling, which might be a net positive for assets and risk assets, including crypto. But one of the problems you and I always have is the quality of data. What did you see this week that made you and I say, what the heck, when we looked at the data?
Well, I think, as I focus on it, I look at a couple of things. And one of the things is you look at the jobs data, and most of the hiring are like government jobs. So they're not even private sector jobs. And, one could certainly wonder why, kind of the government's hiring more people. Feels like we're fully staffed in the government so that we're hiring this many more people. What are they doing? That's up for a whole nother podcast. So I think the quality of the jobs, and their short-term jobs. And then as far as inflation goes, it's 1/10 below. I think statistically it'll be helpful to lower rates. And we've said before on the podcast, we thought the first rate cut would be in September. I feel like we're pretty spot on there. But, I wanted to pull a couple of stats from today with the, PPI today, and just a couple of things to keep in mind. And then I really want to hear what your thoughts are about this. So U.S. consumer sentiment for this month was the second worst since 2012. And that basically there are more households who are 90 plus days behind on their credit card bills than there have been for a number of years. So it seems like you have consumers who are barely hanging on, and I think their lack of spending or kind of reducing their spending, maybe helping inflation a little bit, but it's sort of a backwards way to get there.
And David, when we look at that, when we look at that data, and I just got a note from Josh, I guess the Gulfstream does have Wi-Fi. She'll be dialing in, David, in a moment. When we parse through that data, and again, the crypto correlation here is that as interest rates come down, risk on might be a better play. People will look at crypto potentially. But, looking at inflation, it really is a different story for the everyday person when you net out, think food and fuel, for example. I still have the hypothesis that it's going to be a bit of a bumpier landing than people think. The Fed has a long history, it's not a political conversation, just a long history of really having a hard time managing the landing of such a complex economy. Josh, we see you. How are you?
I'm great, but how are you? And do you only see a silhouette of me?
You have a very bright halo behind you somewhere in Brussels.
Okay, yes. Well, I am going to mute myself and try to lower the thing so you can see my face.
We will be here. So we were just talking about the economics of what's going on in the data. David, the real concern for me is always the revisions. As we look at things like housing, when we look at the overhang of, there's I think it's 800 billion in commercial real estate loans that might be problematic. I'm always concerned about the macro implications for that. And by extension, the macro implications for, where's crypto going to go? And on top of all of that is, where's spot ETH ETFs? Where are the wirehouses coming into play here? So I think summer's going to be a little bit bumpy. I think you're right, David. We'll probably get the interest rate cut in September. The big kind of potential black swan event in my mind is the election. And I'm concerned about where that goes. Josh, we're just talking about the crazy economics of what's going on and the quality of data. I'm assuming the Gulf Stream landed safely in Belgium and that you've got Wi-Fi. I don't know if you've got any perspectives on that, but yeah, David, that's my perspective on the economy and where things are going.
You know what? I'll connect the dots for Josh a little bit. I'll make it easier for her, and I'll connect the dots. So the way I'm going to think about it is, if people think there's going to be a rate cut, there's going to be a rotation into riskier assets. And you already saw that with small caps kind of gaining some momentum and having a good day yesterday when tech and some of the large caps sold off. So I think you can look at the Russell 2000, and that can be sort of like your canary in the crypto mine to see where the things are going to head in the crypto space. But I'm actually very bullish. And one of the reasons I'm very bullish is that, as you may know, the German government, in their infinite wisdom, decided to do a fire sale and sell 50,000 Bitcoin, over $2 billion in 2 weeks. No sort of plan with a large asset manager to sell it sort of at optimum prices. They basically were just dumping it every day. And, the ETF inflows were eating up a lot of that volume. So I think that with all these, sort of negative overhangs, and you still have some Mt. Gox selling, I really think that we're sort of basing here and consolidating. And, I think, the fall will be pretty bullish. I think barring, a non-election black swan event, I think we're really headed in a good direction. And this is a really good time. Again, we're not giving investment advice. Yeah. But if you are thinking about like getting a position in Bitcoin or Ethereum, this is probably a nice time to consider that some more.
David, to that point, real quickly, when you do look at overall asset prices in the crypto space, a lot of the move from the greed fear index is now approaching neutral into fear, which is always generally a buy symbol. David, you and I have texted about the other side of this conversation, which is the non-crypto world, which is continual all-time highs for the Dow, the Russell, the NASDAQ, and the S&P, for example, give or take. And to me, that's a little frothy. I'd like to see a little bit of the price pressure come out of that. And I think I saw a data point that the recent S&P all-time highs were based on a lower number of issues. It's the top 7, 8, 10 firms. It's not broadly based across all 500. Someone tell me if I'm wrong, but to me, that is kind of a petering out of price rise increases in the equities market. But overall, I agree with you, David. I think the fall will be good. I think we've got to get through a little bit of what's left of an ugly summer.
Yeah, and look, the last thing is the ETF, which I did think would be trading by today, will likely start trading, in my estimation, sometime towards the end of next week or the beginning of the following week. And look, I think that's going to be really bullish for Ethereum. And also, you don't have that massive overhang like we had with GBTC. So ETHE is trading almost par or maybe even a slight premium. So I don't think, you'll have that massive overhang. People will move to lower cost ETFs, but I think that move will be gradual. So I'm feeling very bullish about, especially Ethereum right now, and what we might see once the ETFs go live.
Josh, remind me, did I wager with David about the spot ETH ETF?
Oh, goodness. I can't remember whether it was a wager because I remember you saying you didn't like to keep losing to David's crystal ball. So I can't remember whether a wager was actually made. We'll have to go back and
we'll have to replay the tape. We'll have to go back to the videotape as more
tape. Exactly. By the way, so I'm just curious, like, what your thoughts are, whether you think this plays in at all. Like, what I've heard now this is not crypto related, and again, not investment advice, but I've been hearing that the private credit markets have roared back. That they'd been quiet, but they really roared back, especially like CLOs and things like that. And it's because while, it's unclear when a rate cut will happen, people are feeling pretty comfortable that a rate hike is unlikely in their view to happen. And so borrowers that have been standing on the sidelines because they didn't want to end up in a situation where they ended up with a higher rate are really coming in. If also, perhaps unrelated to that, I've seen personally like an uptick in inquiries and deals involving crypto lending. Right? So I'm just curious about whether that ties into any of your mystic data analysis.
The Oracle of Delphi, Mr. Brill.
Yeah, well, look, I will say this. FOMO is real, whether it's in people's personal lives or in their professional lives. And look, I think that there's a lot of money that's been raised. There's money on the sidelines. The AI valuations are getting really high. You may have seen like the top two. I think the CEO of NVIDIA sold some shares, and one other senior person sold some shares in the last 2 days. I think people are doing a little profit taking, and I think some of the valuations in crypto have kind of reset. So I think this is a good opportunity to fund some things, and people are looking at M&A. I've definitely been getting calls about that, and we're talking to people about working with them on these type of deals. So I'm not surprised, Josh. I think that this is a good time to put money to work in crypto, whether it's as a professional or as a personal investor.
I agree with David. Just on the private credit conversation, it really, does feel to me, Josh, like the less risk averse firms. So a lot of the private credit stuff are being picked up by hedge funds that are much more comfortable with risk than some others. When you're looking at alpha in a declining interest rate world, you're going to get real alpha in good private credit investments, and it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. I don't see specific strategies when I have these conversations. They're really looking at double-digit returns, or at least estimating double-digit returns in the private credit market. We can have very deep political conversations, David, about regulators want to engage more deeply and regulate more deeply the private credit market and beyond. But it's the chase for alpha, and they're preparing themselves. I still feel there's a lot of money. It's a lot of dry powder on the sides with those organizations that are comfortable with risk.
Yeah, I totally agree. So what about, Josh, what are you hearing in Brussels?
Well, in Brussels, I'm here for the Polkadot Decoded conference. So I'm mostly hearing about things in the Polkadot ecosystem, which is always interesting and good. I haven't, other than that, I haven't really been attuned to what's happening in Brussels more broadly, just because I've been focused at that.
Can I point out one thing? Every time it's turning out to be true in every broadcast, every time one of us mentions investment or high risk, I hear sirens somewhere in the background. And I suspect it's in Brussels. Josh, if I'm wrong, it's you.
Who knew? I thought I live on the tip of the east side. There shouldn't be fire engines over here. It's all residential, but no, of course, while we're doing it.
I feel like doing the disclaimer again, but I noticed some of these things in the broadcast, David and Josh.
Yeah, the universe is sending a sign.
One of the other things I wanted to raise, David, Josh, if I could, is, we took July 4th off here in the States, and I hope you guys had great times with the family, and it's been super busy since then. One of the other things that was really important was a lot of the Supreme Court decisions. We will avoid some of the more controversial ones. Obviously, there's a lot of deep thought and thought leadership on both sides of the argument there. But the Chevron deference overturn, and I'm probably misphrasing that, Josh, correct me if I'm wrong, was really an important milestone. Many people saw it as a way of, quote unquote, reining in the administrative state. A lot of others saw it as, well, you just made, the courts even busier, regulators are the subject matter experts. And there's an argument that this directly impacts the broader crypto markets and world in the US. What did you think when you read about the Chevron decision from the Supreme Court, Josh?
So, on one hand, was I surprised? Not really, given the folks on the Supreme Court right now and given the trends, right? Mm-hmm. On the other hand, I think, to me, it's a big potential win for many industries, including crypto, right? Because Chevron and major questions doctrine, in my mind, go hand in hand. I do think, and this is something that I'd love to hear from others about as well, but I have read certain articles, as I'm sure you guys have as well, where, people are pointing out, well, with the end of Chevron, perhaps even in terms of like crypto legislation that's out there in draft legislation or things that are being under consideration, maybe you need to be more specific, because the ability to punt things and not decide in the legislation on tricky points, and to punt it back to the regulators to come to decisions about, perhaps that will be, more difficult. And maybe we need more specificity at the legislative stage. So,
it's a really interesting point, Josh. Thank you, David. To that point, one of the counter arguments I've heard is, well, let me ask this: is it unreasonable for the court to point back to that Congress and say, do your job, do more detailed work here? It should be something that comes out of the Congress. When you have a lot of opponents of the decision saying, well, the subject matter experts aren't in Congress, they're in the regulators. How true is that?
Boy, I'll give a lawyer answer and say it depends. Look, I think ultimately Congress represents the people, and they are the ones who should be doing the lawmaking. And driving the regulatory agencies to implement the lawmaking that's done and the regulations around the lawmaking. Now, on a practical level, that's not really the case a lot of the time, or there's so many things going on in the world, and our Congress has struggled to pass a lot of legislation, I would say, in the last 10, 20 years. And it's not a political comment. It's just sort of depending on who's in charge. It doesn't matter who's in charge, just that's the way it's going to be. But I do think that ultimately the buck needs to stop with Congress. And, I do think that if you have a regulator who's implementing regulations or interpreting things that are not consistent with what the law is, or sort of being creative with their arguments in a way that's not consistent with how the law should be applied, then Congress needs to step in. And I actually think this is a good segue, and I want to hear what Josh thought of Justice Jackson's opinion in the Binance case, because I see Chevron and Justice Jackson's opinion sort of playing hand in hand. The Supreme Court talking about taking discretion away, and then Justice Jackson talking about how the SEC and the Binance case, by not regulating crypto, has sort of abdicated their duties and left it to the courts. So I don't know if you see that symbiosis there, Josh, but I'm curious to know what you thought of her opinion and your view of that.
So I think that's a great point. I also, before I get there, can I just say one other thing other than, yes, I'm finally out of the crypt. I figured out the lighting in this hotel room. I think just before we go right to that, one of the things that also has come to mind with Chevron is the rulemaking, right? Because there's all this pending rulemaking, including about the expansion of the definition of exchange. And we saw Uniswap Labs come out with, reasons for which the SEC shouldn't adopt those rules, query whether they're going to be inclined to listen to Uniswap on that point or not. But I just think the Chevron deference point may make them less likely to engage in rulemaking, or perhaps to adopt these rules. But with respect to the decision, I think, David, I think you're right. And I think one of the exciting things about the opinion, yes, a lot went through, and it was an early stage opinion, right? One of the earliest stages in the case. But look, secondary sales out the window, right? And I think that, to me, it's a powerful point. And the fact that Judge Jackson decided to, unlike Judge Rakoff, Judge Jackson, looked at Ripple and said, look, this makes sense to me. And maybe not in so many words, but followed that, with the caveat, of course, that Ripple didn't actually reach that decision. Judge Torres didn't actually reach a decision about secondary sales. But yeah, I think that's a huge win for the industry, and that definitely goes along with reining in regulators.
Josh, for what it's worth, it looks like you're in a professional movie studio, news studio. You've got the lighting down pat. Well done.
The screen came down, so you can't see the background of Brussels, and
Josh, to that point though, I obviously I'm not an attorney. The two of you are, and when I read about it and that secondary sales are off the table, it made me wonder about this long-running conversation around the industry is trying to build case law that supports the growth of the industry. The opponents rather are trying to build case law, particularly the SEC, that say look, everything's a security. You're all, you're rife with non-compliance. I'm wondering what the progress of that kind of philosophic development is. And let me tell you why. In the context of the Binance case, certainly, one of the other interesting court decisions, commentaries I had seen, and I don't remember the judge's name, was in Coinbase v. SEC. And I believe it was the judge who came back to SEC, Coinbase attorneys, and said, this is not good for you. They were requesting access to Chair Gensler's private emails. I presume based on this idea that there's this great conspiracy to debank and kind of destroy the crypto industry, whether or not that's true. And if I remember the judge's wording, it was something along the lines of, essentially, this is not good for your case, and it doesn't look good for the reputation of you and the organization. What do you make of that kind of development in the context of all of this case law?
David, do you want to go first?
That was her way of saying you go first, David.
Well, look, it's challenging because I don't know from a discovery standpoint, how much of a regulator's emails a litigant should have access to. Even if they do get access, you're going to argue about redactions. I mean, I do think that a tailored search and discovery, I think it should be allowed on some levels, but you are getting into a very sort of sticky place, and there should be some privilege for private litigants' emails, and there should be some, although it doesn't feel like there's anyone, there's a government agency involved, but it's a very sticky place, Ron, and so I don't think there's a bright line answer to it, but I do think whether seeing it firsthand or seeing it summarized, that there should be discovery, and there should be the ability to create a fair process for the litigants. So hopefully that wasn't too much of a lawyer answer, but I do think it's a very nuanced situation we're in, and there's not a bright line way to sort of deal with discovery.
Go ahead, Josh.
And I was just going to say, if you think back to the Ripple case and the Hinman emails, right, and the whole question of whether they could fall within privilege because he was speaking in his own capacity, and ultimately they came out. I mean, I do think in terms of context, it can be helpful. And I also think, who knows, maybe there's smoking guns in there somewhere, that people hope to find. But also, just shaping the just sneeze. Shaping the
what is happening in Belgium?
I lowered the screen and all.
All right. I'll pick that up.
David, let me just follow up on what Josh is saying, though, because I want to go back to one thing, and I want to be clear to the audience and everyone who's going to be watching this. When we talk about we're talking about Chevron, it should be default to the experts. I didn't mean to imply there are not experts at the regulators. I think one of the things I'm trying very hard to explain or understand, David, is there are a lot of really smart people at the SEC, CFTC, all of these regulatory bodies with many years of experience, legal experience, markets experience. But at the end of the day, and someone tell me if I'm wrong, there are political appointees that head many of these organizations, and I think we have to look at it through that lens. Josh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I just wanted to elaborate on some of that.
Yeah,
you didn't cut me off.
The sneezes cut you off.
And I think, Ron, the issue is, and I agree, of course there are some really smart subject matter experts in those agencies. The question is, are they being enabled to do, what they want to do? Are they enabled to, enact rulemaking? Because it always starts at the top, and at the top are appointees. And so I think the commissioners in the different agencies drive the agenda for the agencies. And so remember, the rulemaking process really allows, people and entities to give comments and to really have thoughtful comments or proposed rules. But if you don't go down the path of create market structure rules, there's nothing to work from. So I think when you look at the deference, I think that's a place where I think it makes a lot of sense, especially where there's a vacuum, where there aren't any rulemaking. There's sort of a view that, everything is fine, just use the current law, it's not complicated. And then when you have this sort of moving dialogue, that's a perfect example where I think the Chevron deference was overturned.
All of the politics of the conversation, we've been messaging with the three of us, and members of the WSBA, one of the other interesting things we had seen, I think it was yesterday, time's kind of escaping me at this point, there was a vote in the House to overturn the president's veto of the rescinding of SAB 121. That's a very wordy sentence right there. And of course, the vote failed by a not insignificant margin. Let's get back to the politics of it and kind of the election perspectives. None of us are political experts. Shout out to Adam Goldberg and Dina Ellis. We'll have to talk about this in the next policy update. But how relevant is that to some of these conversations? And does some of that sway the vote we've been talking about? The three of us talked about, 1%, 2% of vote matter. Is that where the crypto market's going, David and Josh? He wants you to go first.
Josh doesn't want to go first this time. I can just see it in her eyes.
I just think we're in a very fraught time, politically speaking, especially post the debate. I mean, if you just look at the news, and I think there's a lot of, clearly there was a lot of bipartisan support for the repeal of SAB 121 because it went all the way through and it got vetoed. And I have to wonder whether now some people are trying to not go. Well, clearly they're trying to not overturn the veto. They're trying to stand behind the chief executive. So yeah, I mean, actually, and I'll just say this, like, Ron, you would ask what was going on in Brussels. Every cab driver just about that I've had since I've been here who realized that I was from the US when my French was really poor. They were asking me what I thought of the election and who I was going to vote for. So God. I would say, I think not just like I think people are thinking about the strength of the country, the perceived strength of the country, and depending on what side of the aisle they're on, there may be a reason why overturning the veto now might not be the right time in their view.
I always find it interesting whenever I've traveled overseas, colleagues will look at me and ask about what the heck is going on with the politicians in your country. And part of me wants to say, what about the politicians in your country? But that's kind of childish. The other part is, they're kind of right. I couldn't tell you. But it's always really interesting when someone asks who you're going to vote for. I'm always a little bit like, it's like giving you my social security number. I can't tell you that.
Yes.
So I think that it's very hard in an election year to, overturn a veto from the president. I think that the party in charge will not want to do that for a whole host of reasons, whether it be party support, regardless of the merits. So I think we had that sort of going against us. I think generally speaking, though, it's a wrong move. I mean, I do think, and Adam Goldberg pointed this out, that this bill, as it was formulated, would take control over this issue away from the SEC. So I think maybe that is where it needs to be tweaked a little bit. Yeah. But functionally speaking, this needs to change. And I think it will change. It just may not change as quickly as we'd like it to change. But I think it's in consumers' interest that it changes. And my hope is that there is some compromise, shortly, or something at least in the works where bigger entities can, make some arrangements with the SEC to allow things to go forward. And I shared an article with the both of you about that. Yeah. So my hope is maybe behind the scenes, larger entities are getting some relief. But I think ultimately, custody and just one or two or three parties, as good as those custodians are, it's a mistake, and it needs to change.
David, to the point of you mentioning the article you shared, post the failed vote to overturn the veto, the SEC had put out some information this morning that they are tweaking SAB 121. So, David, that's the article you're alluding to. Josh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, and that's something that I think we've talked about in prior weeks, just about that as a possibility, but also just as a practical reality, because I think some of us have seen examples where there has been certain relief granted, in a limited way. But again, it goes back to the question, like, who's getting the relief? And what is it for? Is it really for crypto as we think about it? Or is it really for more traditional securities on a blockchain?
and it's interesting as we have these conversations, ripping up the script again. One of the articles I had seen, it was, I believe, yesterday or the day before, and I believe it was Goldman. David, correct me if I'm wrong, has done several $100 million in tokenization of assets. So again, builders keep building, and we'll have these conversations about politics and law, and I get that, and that's important. We'll even have the conversations about where's Bitcoin's price and what's the support level, David. For the audience, David gets that text message from me probably every week. Like, what's the support level for BTC? But when you look at the Goldmans and the BlackRocks and these really major global organizations tokenizing assets, to me, that's also the progress that I think is very important to this ecosystem.
Yeah, look, I think tokenization, the ability to wring costs out of, whether it be bond offerings or whatever sort of offerings that are done on a regular basis that can leverage the technology, look, it can save a lot of money. It can be more efficient. So why not sort of incorporate that? And I think BlackRock's Buildle fund is over $500 million, and I think that's great. So I think you're really starting to see it happen in slow motion. And I think the train will continue to move forward. But things like SAB 121 aren't helpful for that train to move forward. Even if they're not exactly 100% correlated. It just, those type of things aren't helpful. But I think, the tokenized, real world tokenization is really going to ramp up in this year and the following years. And, we're really at the tip of it right now.
David, Josh, can I go a little technical on something? And David, I'm going to direct this to you to begin with. Our recent enterprise working group meeting had an interesting dialogue. David, forgive me, I don't recall if you were on the meeting, but and I think you've been supportive of the Ethereum kind of blockchain as a use case broadly, correct me if I'm wrong. And a colleague had mentioned to me specifically that, well, that's not, the play is Solana and not Ethereum. Tell me what your thoughts are about that.
Oh, well, we could do a whole.
And that might be a separate webinar. I'm sorry.
Look, I think that there are utility cases and use cases for a number of different blockchains, and they're not only going to be one or two. I mean, we may see a massive consolidation one day and see maybe a dozen, 24 public blockchains, and then a whole host of private ones. But look, right now, I think Solana can do more transactions per minute than Ethereum can. But Ethereum is, battle tested, and Solana's had some challenges where literally the blockchain had to be stopped, for lack of a better word, or on pause. So I think, look, this is an evolving technology, and I think there's room for a number of the players. And I haven't cast my vote one way or the other. I think both of them are really good. I think both of them have really interesting features, reliability, staking, but it's an evolution. So I would say there's room for a number of the big blockchains. And I'm sure the folks at Polkadot, where you're at your conference.
I was going to ask Josh.
Well, their blockchain is certainly one that should be considered. So, I think there's room for a number of them.
Yeah.
How was the event, Josh? Go ahead.
I mean, I'll be heading out to some things later. It's great. It's fantastic. I'm really excited about what's happening in the ecosystem. And I spoke on a panel about regulatory, right, with Angie Dalton, who's our friend, and also with Chrissy Hill, who is the GC for Parity. Yeah, it's great. I mean, I'm particularly excited about the gaming, right, with Mythical and Dot Play and a whole bunch of other folks out there, different plans. But yeah, I think I'm just excited to see, like you say, builders keep building. I mean, gamers keep gaming.
That's right.
And, it all comes together. I do think it's interesting, though. I won't speak about ETFs and any particular token. But did you guys see that, some people have pointed out that, okay, well, in the case of Bitcoin and ETH, there were futures, right? And we don't have futures for the other tokens, but just in the past couple of days, it appears that with respect to the CBOE, there were applications for Solana ETF futures. ETFs. Sorry. I think I said ETFs a couple times when it should have only been said once. But yeah, so I think that's an interesting move. What I do wonder though is, one of the big things with Ether was that the applicants had to remove the staking. Yeah. And I just wonder what kind of an effect that would have on different ecosystems without the staking.
It's interesting because I think, David, Josh, what the latest estimate I had seen on the Ethereum ecosystem is that something like 20+% of it is staked. I could be wrong, but on the futures, it's interesting, Josh, because futures markets in general, for the kind of approvals we're talking about, require a certain breadth and depth of liquidity.
Yeah.
And I wonder, I don't have the comparative data in front of me, but it's a really interesting question. Like, how does an Ethereum future market compared to a Solana futures market, or a Shiba market, joking aside? But so those are really important developmental questions for these different ecosystems, and the idea that every crypto is going to have an ETF is really wildly misplaced in my mind.
I do wonder whether, just by announcing these things, whether that ups the demand and ups the potential liquidity.
Fair
right?
Point.
So I don't know. But David, go ahead.
No, I think like we've talked about before, if you think that's the direction things are going, you need to get your paperwork in, and you need to get the S1 in, and you need to get the process moving. And it used to be it was first in time would be first to market. So I certainly understand it, and I'm supportive of more opportunities for the public to buy crypto if they don't want to use a crypto exchange. But I'm really skeptical that we would see that anytime this year. And I think, frankly, it would take a different administration next year for that to happen. Because remember, Solana was named in the Binance lawsuit as one of the 10 tokens that that the SEC considered to be securities. So I don't see in this current regime at the SEC that they will flip on that and suddenly allow a Solana ETF.
Yeah. So, ironically, both campaigns are taking Bitcoin for donations, but I'll leave my cynicism comments aside, David.
Well, I have a bigger irony, and we talked about this on the podcast a few weeks ago, that I think the Marshal's office is using Coinbase to sell the confiscated cryptocurrency that they have, and not only Bitcoin but other ones. So, basically, the Marshal Service is hiring Coinbase, who the SEC says is a legal market and should be regulated, and is allowing them to sell commodities and what they consider to be unregulated securities. So it's a very interesting dynamic. And again, as I said every time, I support Coinbase. I only mention it because they are the vendor in this case. But like sometimes I think you can make these different fact patterns up. But I think it's what makes this whole ecosystem so fascinating to everybody.
Crypto has strange bedfellows, David. I'm watching a thunderstorm approach rapidly, so I think it might be worth wrapping it up here. Josh, when the Gulf Stream flies you out of Brussels airport, what are you going to be focusing on in the coming week?
Wow, in the coming week, a lot of work. Yeah. A lot of work. But all good. I mean, I think it's an exciting time. Like I was saying, like even just being here with teams, just the energy is incredible. And I think, I don't know, that's what I'm excited about. What about you guys?
I got to ask David. So David, when your 72-meter Benetti super yacht pulls into the Yacht Grand Marina in Miami and you disembark and you get an aperitif, what are you and the entourage going to be talking about? And when will we see the spot ETH ETF? I had to do it.
You always make me laugh about that. But look, I think I will be flying down to Florida tomorrow for a couple of days. I have some meetings in Miami, but not on a big yacht. I will be reading some of the recent court filings, in particular, the adversary proceeding that's been filed against the founders of Celsius. And a number of the preference claims that are being brought against individuals. I'm sort of interested to see the causes of action and the thought process about that. And also there's a big history in the filing sort of spelling everything out. So I'm kind of curious about that. Also, I'm going to be really doing a lot of research on Ethereum and seeing what the trends are and try and figure out how much volume do I think we'll see right away. But I do think that the ETH ETF with everything else going on is sort of an underappreciated story. And so I think you'll see more buzz and talk about it, in the next week. And then the last thing is I'll be, heads down doing a lot of work because I will be going to Bitcoin 2024 and looking forward to being in Nashville and to hearing a certain person speak about crypto at Bitcoin 2024.
David, Josh, I want to give you both the background for my Benetti super yacht comment to David.
Yeah, I was wondering, what kind of life are you living?
I read a lot of stuff, but interestingly, a family member sent me a web link to a website of yachts, and apparently there is this new yacht that is called a new type of yacht called the Quaranta. And my wife wants to know why we don't own it. That's an entirely different conversation. And if you ever want to go down a luxury rabbit hole, just go to like one of these super yacht websites. And I just imagined David on the deck of the super yacht, and I had to go down that. I had to go down that rabbit hole. Just a couple of announcements from me, guys. I will be in Nashville as well, just before the Bitcoin conference. David, I'll be speaking at the Electronic Digital Asset Summit. Shout out to our friends at WSBA member Bitwave and Pat White and Emil Kalnoki and the team over there. So it's going to be a lot of fun. We're doing an event, WSBA get together on the evening of the 23rd. David, I'm looking forward to seeing you and several other colleagues there. I'll probably loiter around the Bitcoin conference and maybe go. I know of whom you're speaking that might be speaking there. I don't know that I want to be there for that. I'm concerned about what the crowds will be like. We're also working very hard on our October 24th event. We'll get the placeholder out there. I'm looking forward to David and Josh and so many others that will be speaking and keynoting there. And book of the week, Josh and David, I finally got around to starting Number Go Up. And I don't know if either of you have read it, but it really reminded me of some of the really crazy stories in the early days of crypto. And some of the characters were really, really interesting. And some of them are just like, what is wrong with you people kind of characters. So it's not a hard read. We all know the history and we know a lot of the players, but if you want a book over a cocktail that makes you sit back and say, yeah, this is some crazy stuff that happened, Number Go Up is the book. So I highly recommend it. We'll leave it there. Josh, David, always great to see you. Safe travels to you both. Thank you everyone who joined. If we missed any questions or comments that you had, drop us a note, info@WSB